No. You said you got it to the easy part.
I did.
Hi there, my name is Michael Miller. I run the restoration shop at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. We're here today with a 1942, was built in 1942 as a Ram gun tank. It was a medium cruiser tank built in the Montreal Locomotive Works, based on a British and Canadian consortium, a tank design. A lot of the components are based on the M3 Lee, as you can see by the tracks and the early suspensions. However, the Ram only had a 6-pounder gun and a fairly small turret ring compared to the Sherman. It was in production a few months before the Sherman, so it beat it to production, but it ended most of its career as a training tank. However, after 1944, after D-Day, the Canadians had borrowed 10 defrock priests from the American Army and loved them. The Americans needed their vehicles back. So we had more than 200 of these in England as training vehicles. So the word went back to pull the turrets, have the engineers clear out the side, and it became the Ram Kangaroo. It was Canada's first really indigenously produced armored personnel carrier. And this one was used in combat from August of '44 right to the end of the war.
How'd you guys get it back to your museum?
It was part of a big trade about 18 years ago. We traded basically 8 or 10 vehicles for one of ours. This was a parts vehicle, but we knew it was a Kangaroo. So it went on to our list of our restoration projects. We finished it about 3 years ago. One of the distinguishing pieces about a Ram compared to an M3 Lee or an M4 Sherman was the little, basically the little auxiliary turret that was on top of the original Lee. They put it down into the hull. It's kind of a tough position to use because with the gun in there, there's very little space. You had a remote trigger, and when you were looking through the viewfinder and pulling it, the 30 caliber is right next to your head. It couldn't have been very comfortable to use. One of the distinctions, the later Rams, the late production models had this cast right out and a ball turret. Again, I mentioned earlier, this is a very early suspension. Came right off the M3 Lee. We got the early VSS with the return roller above, the big block tracks. So same things on all the first few thousand M3 Lees. It's almost indistinguishable. However, the casting was a Canadian-British design. It was cast in the US. At the time, it was the largest sand casting in the world. And you can tell by the rough finish, it was, they even casted, the original models had a little sponson door here, but it was considered to be a weak point. So they cast right over it. The early ones were welded up. The crews didn't like it much because it was easy egress into the tank. You get in or out much easier, but it potentially was a weak spot. The great easy thing about this was we painted up in the colors of Marion II. About 6 years ago, the Kangaroo Regiment in southern Ontario, they had 4 surviving crew members from the Second War, and they wanted to give them a parade. The restoration wasn't done, but we did a cosmetic restoration, put their logo on it, and the previous commander, we had pictures of Marion II. He had 2 of these shot out, one of them shot out from under him, and his second one was Marion II. So the gentlemen are all passed now, but it was, we didn't drive it in the parade, we had it in the back of a float, but we put them in it and they had a full color guard. It was a wonderful event. She's 80 years old. We used a lot of new old stock parts. When we did this, we're also restoring a Ram gun tank. We had 2 vehicles restoring, we had 2 donor vehicles. So we took the best, for this one, we took the best of the old road wheels, the volute springs, and you can see down here, you know, even when we run them at shows like this, we tend to lose rubber. So we're always looking for new parts. Even the new old stock is 80 years old. So that's one of the biggest challenges, is looking and finding spare parts for these. New old stock, 25 years ago, new old stock parts were plentiful. After the war, collectors, they were in warehouses, collectors bought them. We thought there would be a never-ending supply of engines and parts, but ever since basically 1994, in museums and collectors around the world, for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, started taking an interest in Sherman variants and all other military equipment. Every museum in the world is restoring tanks now. The new old stock parts are disappearing quickly. We're come to the point we have to start making some of our parts in case of utilize 3D printing. But I'm always on hunt for new old stock, even parts we can rebuild. I'm always on the hunt. That's a big part of the job now. Just, you can see the rough casting. Even in production, if there was a mistake or there was a blemish in the casting, they would use a welding rod to fix it. Even if your hull was damaged, they could weld up. And here's a good example. This wasn't combat damage, I don't think. It was probably an imperfection in the casting, which they just filled with a welding rod. You see it a lot on cast hulls, T-34s, M4A1 Shermans. In the end, They experimented with cast armor, but in the end, I think they found that the welded armor was stronger, especially with the welded joints. And now we're going to talk about the most important part of this vehicle, is power pack. It was powered by a Wright Continental R975 9-cylinder radial. And I'm going to turn you over to my compatriot here, Mark, to explain the engine.
Hi, I'm Mark Weisbrod, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the engine in this vehicle. I've been a volunteer with the War Museum starting this year. I've been with Mike, but previously in the mid-90s I was with the War Museum. I got a chance to work on a lot of vehicles, Sherman-based vehicles, even modern vehicles, and really had a blast. So now that I'm retired, I'm having the time of my life with these guys, maintaining these and keeping them running. As Mike mentioned, this is the Continental R975. They wanted an engine that had a ton of torque, that could move a heavy vehicle, but was easy to service and air-cooled. So take an airplane engine and put it in a tank. So it's a ton of torque with very low RPMs, and this is that engine. Average car nowadays has a 2-liter motor. This one's 16 liters, 975 cubic inches, and it's supercharged. So if you're a car person or a tank person, we've got an updraft carburetor that then feeds in through the supercharger. We've got our starter generator. We've got 2 magnetos. The magnetos create the spark that ignite the ignition. And there's plugs, 2 plugs per cylinder. This motor produces a ton of power, as you've experienced. It drives this vehicle very nicely. The downside, leaks a lot of oil, and it sprays this whole engine compartment with oil. So after it's been run, it's a fair bit of cleanup. We cheated a little bit. The air cleaners on the side, the original air cleaners, were not serviceable. So we've just stuck on a couple of K&N filters. A little modern touch, makes it a little bit easier to service it. But this motor was rebuilt a few years ago by the museum, and it's a beautiful running motor.
What are some of the things that you have to do to keep it maintained?
Well, once the vehicle sits for a while, the first thing we do before we do anything is pull the bottom 2 spark plugs out. We want to make sure there's no accumulated oil in there. So we pull the plugs out and make sure they're drained, make sure the plugs are in good condition, reinstall the plugs, get that motor cranked over, which you've got some experience with, and really then make sure that the fuel is clean, the fuel is flowing properly, and it's got lots of oil in it. And from there, we go. Once we're ready to start the vehicle, we start it with the engine hatches open, and we do that with a fire extinguisher in hand. We want to make sure that there's no backfires, there's no ignition of anything inside here. And when the vehicle starts, it blows a lot of smoke because there's a lot of oil in the cylinders. Once the cylinders are starting to clean up and the idle comes down and it starts to run nice, you got to close these doors. So a hat and eye protection, and then moving up these armored doors one after another, and then bolting them shut while it's running, blowing hot air at you and the occasional flame. So you want to get low and out of the way and get these bolted up without too much of an issue. So if you'll excuse me, I'll actually take the time in here and I'll bolt it up. About this time, you're hoping that the bolts were shorter. Now that's easy to do when it's not running. When this thing's blowing oil and smoke at you, like I said, a hat and goggles, the way to go.
Well, we're here in the interior of the Ram Kangaroo with the turret off. It's very much laid out like an M4 Sherman or an M3 Lee before it. We've got a couple of radiators in here. We've got an oil cooler, transmission cooler. You can see the lines running to and from the transmission. These get quite warm in operation and they're necessary. Oil reservoir tank, and in the middle, one of the most important parts, the prop shaft. This is an aircraft engine. It was called the prop shaft, and that gives us power to the transmissions, but then goes to the final drive. This is very much laid out. A lot of things are very similar to the M3 Lee, except this, as I mentioned earlier, this was a British-Canadian conglomeration. So, of course, it's British. We had the right-hand drive. So it means everything had changed. The gear shaft had to switch to the right-hand side of the transmission. Instead of a nice locking levers like in the Sherman, there's actually a handbrake here for parking. It's difficult to engage. It's even more difficult to disengage when you're sitting in the driver's seat. The biggest difference between this and a Sherman, say, the Sherman, when you're driving, your hatch is up. It's one of the most beautiful Second War vehicles to drive. It's a comfortable driving position. It's the exact same clutch, the exact same yoke layout. But here in this design, you're driving like your seat down all the time. So, and the driver's got this little 21-inch hole to look out. So unlike, hatch up in the Sherman, lovely to drive, this not so much. It's a bit of effort, especially as, I'm getting, that's not, 30 years ago it was less effort. But, it's a very tight spot. The seat doesn't go back very far, and if you're at all tall, it's difficult to actually work the clutch. It's so close, but we manage. The dash down here is pretty much straight out of the M3 Lee. We've got our normal temperature, oil pressure, volts, ammeter, miles per hour. One of the most important for the driver is the RPM. Because a lot of guys, you don't actually look at it very often when you're driving, but you go by sound. The original men back in '94 that taught me how to drive Shermans they were actually second war and Korean era Sherman drivers. They taught me about the shifting, how to listen. Especially when your head's up, you can't look at your gauges. Go by sound. Go by sound and feel, which to this day still works. When you're starting these, to start these radials, you've got a booster button. They've got a booster to give you a little extra juice on the ignition side. That's your starter. Here, this is very important. It's being an aircraft engine. It's got two magnetos, left and right, or front and rear bank. So when they're both running, that gives you power. Then the magnetos create their own power. You don't need, unlike a water car, you don't always need a battery to keep running the ignition. The magnetos will do it for you. Very much like an aircraft. And this little piece of equipment over here, it's actually original. These are both original to one of our donor vehicles. It's just kept the hours on your engine hour time. And the key to this, the most important thing on this dash, is a primer pump. These engines will not start very well unless you can prime this primes the top 6 cylinders with gas, just a little bit to help with the ignition. And without that, it doesn't start very easily. Now that is pretty basic. Headlights, taillights, fuel cutoff switch. Pretty simple design. This is a reproduction dash. I have the original at the shop, but I'm still looking for the original dials on these were right out of the Chrysler factory. They were these beautiful convex glass lenses. I found some in Australia, but they can't ship them to me because they're all covered in radium, all the radium paint. So they can't ship them. Maybe if I get down someday, I can smuggle them home in my luggage. But at this point, I've gone with these are all World War II era gauges, but out of much later vehicles. This was a very significant Canadian production during the war. It's a number 19 set. You might notice on this one, it's in Cyrillic, English, and even Chinese. We made these to send to all of our then allies around the world. They were, I think, pretty close to 250,000 of these produced in Toronto during the war. And it served as our radio, short-range, long-range radio, and the intercom system for the vehicle. This one is obviously non-functioning, but you see over here, you notice the commander's throat mic that would hang on the front chest. The driver would have had, as you had right earlier, as a driver, I can't hear a thing in here. Without the intercoms, I depend on somebody kicking me in the back of the shoulder, tapping me, saying this, that, right, left. Here we have an original Vickers made little periscope. It's little worse for wear, but it's original. It was a 1941 production. They were designed for these. So you had a very limited, when this hatch was closed, you could see virtually nothing, and otherwise the driver could peek like this. So very, very limited space. You depended on your commander, much like modern vehicles. The commander was the eyes and ears, and you either went hopefully by intercom or kicks in the back of the head. Well, here's your driving position. Basically, it's a 5-speed transmission. You've got this button is an interlock here. This lets you go over and all the way back is reverse, and all the way first gear. You would use reverse a lot. First gear you only ever use if you're in deep mud or towing another vehicle. Generally, when I start off, you got second gear all the way down here. Now with these vehicles, double clutching was probably the best way to shift them, but if you listen closely, you can shift by sound to mesh the synchros up. But in my operation today, I'm second gear here. Push the clutch in, shift to neutral, let the clutch out, push it back in, shift into third. And that's the easiest way to drive them when you don't get a lot of practice. And this again, that has second, third, fourth, and a gear we never use, fifth.
Why don't you ever use fifth?
We don't have a big enough space to get up to that kind of speed. At the museum, our little test track It's so short. Basically I use second and reverse. It was a pleasure here being the track getting to third and fourth gear. And it's a standard, these were called tiller bars. This is how you steered. Essentially, if you want to stop, you both pull tillers back. They break both tracks. If you want to turn left, you ease back on the left stick. What that does, it cuts power. When you first start pulling, it cuts power to the left track, and as you pull harder, it actually actuates your brakes. This kind of vehicle, unlike some vehicles, you can't do a pivot turn. It takes about 40 feet to do a turn in this, if you've got decent brakes. So not exactly an agile vehicle, but very useful. This system was set up, especially in the Shermans. You have to understand that the world was coming out of a depression. When the United States got involved in the Second War in 1941, they were training these tank drivers. That's why the TM manuals are so good from that era. Some of these kids had never finished school. So you made these beautiful, easy to read manuals, easy to read technical diagrams, and you could train a young guy in a couple of days to drive a Sherman tank. It's pretty much like driving a tractor or a car they were used to at the time. Pretty simple, very reliable. I can't say enough about the reliability of the Sherman. It was, even the M3 Lee before it, same basic drivetrain. When the British got them in North Africa, it was a game changer. These vehicles could go 200 miles at their own power, whereas their tanks at the time had to be trucked everywhere. Plus the fact that it had a gun that could shoot high explosive ammunition made a big difference in the war. They're not easy to drive, but they're not particularly difficult. It's just a little bit of practice. So down here, all I've got a clutch, I've got a gas pedal, and tiller bars. These are my brakes. So left turn, right turn, stop. Not quite so easy. You've got to really feather the clutch and the gas, especially in the mud like this. But it's a lot of fun.
So the engine is a Continental R975. It's a 9-cylinder radial engine. So the cylinders are arranged in a circle, top cylinders and bottom cylinders. It will get oil that leaks down into the bottom cylinders. If it pools up enough and you turn the motor over, it destroys the motor, breaks the rods, breaks everything. That's where a little crank friend comes in. We turn the motor over through the starter, and it lets you know, A, if there's anything down there that you got to worry about, and B,
No, hell no.
any oil that is down there, it starts to circulate through the motor and it gets going. So it gets easy and then it gets harder, and this is what it's all about. Now, let me just get through a hard part, get to the easy part for you to start.
No. If you say so.
Push.
No. You said you got it to the easy part.
I did.
Oh no! Shit! I stepped it out. I pulled it.
It's okay. We get it back in there for you.
I warned you. This shit would be hard. There we go.
There you go.
Okay. Nope, this is not easy.
But you're doing it.
This is what diets in a bad back gives you. Can't do nothing.
You only have to do it once a day during the morning before you start.
Okay. Oh gosh.
You would have had forearms the size of ours.
Right? Yeah. There we go.
Here, Mike, hold this for a second.
I don't got none.
Oh, why not? You'll be retired next year.
How's that?
Much better.
19,000
I'll be in.
Well, we do it 60 times. I don't think you need to do it 60
I don't
times.
think I need to do it 60 times.
Radial engine leaks oil everywhere. That's the best way to put it. If it's not leaking oil, it's out of oil. The way it lubricates, there's a lot of oil movement in it. But when you're done with it, this is what you're going to see. Firstly, there probably is a little bit of oil up there.
Yep.
Bear in mind, when we started, this was white and clean.
Damn.
And there was no oil up here. It literally sprays oil all around the engine compartment. So we'll clean it up.
Need no help?
Do you want to get dirty?
Sure.